Well, thanks for being here with us today, and a big thank you to the National Adaptation Forum for having us, and also to the volunteers that are making these sessions happen. Thanks a lot. I feel very fortunate to share this session with my fellow panelists, and I hope that you enjoy what we have prepared for you. I want to introduce them in the order in which they're gonna be speaking today, so that later in the lightning talks, we just go one after the other. So this just a brief introduction so that you get to know who's speaking here today. So Andrew Kruckziewicz, who will be actually joining us via video, is a senior staff research associate at the Columbia University International Research Institute for Climate Society and a lecturer. Amongst many issues, Andrew explores the role of satellites, remote sensing technology and data for sector-specific applications to map spatial and temporal patterns of precipitation, temperature, and other climatic and geophysical variables to increase the understanding of risk for decision-making. Vincenzo Bollettino is the director of the Resilient Communities program at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. With decades of experience both in academia and as a practitioner, his current research focuses on civil-military engagement during humanitarian emergencies, disaster preparedness and resiliency, the professionalization of humanitarian aid field, and humanitarian leadership. And he's here. Udo Nehren, over there, is a professor of ecosystem management at Köln University of Applied Sciences. His research looks at environmental change, ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction and adaptation, and ecosystem management with regional focuses in Latin America and Southeast Asia. Emily Gvino, over there, is a planner working at Clarion Associates, a national land use planning consulting firm, and her work focuses on the environmental, climate resiliency, and health aspects of planning. She recently graduated from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill with a Master's of Public Health and Master's of City and Regional Planning. And she will be presenting research that she conducted at UNC together with Professor Felix Dodds, who could not be here with us today. And finally, my name is Lidia Cano. I'm a PhD candidate at MIT at the Department of Urban Studies and Planning, and my research focuses on exploring what are the contributions of participatory planning to adaptation for extreme weather events. And I also take or understand the notion of a stakeholder in an expansive manner to include nature and its rights to stand as an additional stakeholder to plan for climate adaptation. So without further ado, we will start our lightning talks with the talk from Andrew. And then after that, we will open, I guess this was the introduction, we'll have the lightning talks, and then we'll open for discussion. So the first one will be a video that I'm gonna play now, and I hope that the audio is okay. Otherwise, please let me know.
Good morning, everyone. I am Andrew Kruckziewicz. I apologize I can't be there today in person. I would have very much appreciated the opportunity to be in the National Adaptation Forum in Baltimore, but I'm calling you from I'm speaking with you from the Netherlands. Yes, and today I'll be sharing a bit about our work in Ecuador, specifically on the concept of anticipatory action. So this is moving from early warning data availability to using that data to inform early action ahead of, in this case, flash floods in Ecuador. So yes, this project it's a NASA-funded project. It's also developed in relation with GEO, which is the Group on Earth Observations, and I have a few of our other partners here, University of Oklahoma, the Red Crescent Climate Center, and also the Ecuadorian Red Cross, in addition to INAMI, which is the Meteorological and Hydrologic Service of Ecuador. But yes, in this picture, you see Quito. I'm not sure if anyone here has been to Quito, but it's a very large and growing city. It's a high altitude city. in a valley between various mountains and volcanoes. And yes, there is a high risk of flash floods. Now, there's always been, to some extent, a high risk of flash floods, but things are changing. Heavier rainfall events are occurring. Communities are expanding to parts of the city where people did not live before. And yes, that interface is leading to increased risk, specifically of flash floods and impactful flash floods. In this picture, you could see one of the local community members of a community in Quito called La Gasca. This area has seen a few flash floods, impactful flash floods over the past decades, but actually this year there was a devastating flash flood. And this was a picture taken by me when I was hosted by the Ecuador Red Cross. You could see Red Cross staff there on the left, but also in this picture you have the local community government leaders standing towards the back. You have the Ecuador Risk Secretariat, and then you also have Dr. Liliana Troncoso standing kind of just in the middle there, who's one of the leading geophysicists in Ecuador. So this was the team that we brought to learn more about what flash floods mean to this community. What did the impact look like? Who was most impacted? Were the most underserved populations, or traditionally underserved populations, those who lost their life and lost property in this case? And it was critical to do a lot of listening to what the community members' perception of risk was, what type of warning did they receive, what actions were taken, what actions could have been taken, perhaps if there was a little more warning, or which so often is the case in many parts of the world, many times even when there is a desire to take action based on a warning, where do the resources come from? And that's a big part of our work in moving from data availability, alerts of flood risk, to what are the standard operating procedures for doing something about it? What areas are prioritized? And again, what actions and where does the funding come from to take those actions? So here's another part of Ecuador. Well, part of Quito, actually, just north of the city. This picture is taken from an area called Calderon. And it looks different, right, than the other picture. The other picture overlooking Quito, we were in a densely populated area on the side of a mountain. This is more of in a valley, a high elevation valley, but it's a drier area. And it's also a location where population growth has increased significantly in the past few years, where people didn't live in this area 10 to 20 years ago. But we see here a small stream. Here we see some green vegetation. And this is a stream that has always existed to some extent. But in recent years, there's been reports in this community of Calderon that floods are, or let's say the stream flow has increased during heavy rainfall events. And it's interesting because there recently occurred here a flood, and it had never happened before. And there's questions about who was impacted, what was damaged. And essentially the community members here said, well, we were fortunate. There really wasn't much damage on infrastructure, and there was no loss of life. However, things are getting worse. What can we do now to prevent a devastating flash flood, such as the other events that we hear in other parts of Ecuador and Quito? And this here is just a comparison of what happened a few months ago. I believe this was in July. There was a flash flood that changed this area from looking like the left picture to looking on the right. Now, that's a pretty significant difference there. Again, this is not, you don't see houses washed away or infrastructure washed away necessarily, but this whole embankment has eroded. And perhaps many of you can see how this is a troubling situation for the next time there is a heavy rainfall event. You could also see the team there. That's the same group of people that we went to the other location, La Gasca, to look at the flash floods. But again, even in this case, there was a lot of listening to what the community was interested in terms of what actions they could take, what warnings were useful, what warnings were not useful. Many times these early warning systems are are deemed to be high quality based on good science that goes into them, but that doesn't make them useful, you know. And even if they are useful to some, are the traditionally underserved populations in these communities really the ones benefiting? So that's something that is central to this work and should be to all early warning systems, in my opinion. So in this area of Calderon, there's a lot of questions of what could be done. And the team was taken to this location by one of the community leaders of Calderon to say, well, we actually have these canal type mechanisms that that are designed, you know, to shepherd the water away and control the heavy rainfall during these intense storms. But many times these perhaps aren't cleaned out at the right time, or it's just the rainfall is so erratic that and so frequent that sometimes the silt builds up in these, and it takes time to clean them out. This one they showed us, they recently cleaned this one out after that flood that I just showed you. But there are, in terms of identifying what actions can be taken, this is one of the hardest parts of building not only a community-centric early warning system, but any early warning system. Again, just because we have an alert doesn't mean anything's going to happen. And then even when things happen, doesn't mean the people who need the support the most are getting it. So why Ecuador? Well, Ecuador has been one of the leaders in the anticipatory action within the humanitarian community. And basically, again, what that means is more than just early warning systems. What are the standard operating procedures that need to be in place for action to take place? And then on the right-hand side, you see here this document. It says Ecuador volcanic ashfall. Well, I'm talking about floods, not volcanic ashfall, but this was a standard operating procedure, basically a set of plans for when volcanic ashfall forecasts were exceeding a certain level, then specific actions would be taken by certain people, the funding would be released, and this is all built into the plans here. What we're doing is designing one of these for flash floods. So again, Ecuador has these enabling environments in place in terms of the data, the science, the policy, and now the practice, you know, what is actually going to happen. However, there is still the need for some data analysis. So I'm a meteorologist by background. So one of my areas of interest and where we also bring together our partners in Ecuador is looking at historical data. Does the historical data of flash floods tell us about flash flood risk current? And what does it tell us about flash flood risk in the future? So on the map here, we see a merged database of floods. One of the challenges in Ecuador is there actually was a lot of flood data, but the flood historical data was not disaggregated by flood type. So with our funding from NASA, we worked with different satellite products and socioeconomic data sets to identify which historical flash flood, which historical events labeled as flood are more likely or less likely to be flash floods. And then we could plot these events that are likely to be flash floods across Ecuador to get a sense of the confidence of certain events being flash floods, and then also looking at the impact severity, which is necessary to design anticipatory action systems, not just alerting. So here we have the preliminary results from the last few years, 1,500 flood events. There are 975 potential flash flood events classified across a confidence level from 1 to 10. And again, this is necessary in order to understand what historical data should go in to train the model to prioritize certain areas when we're trying to take early action. So yes, the next steps are working with the University of Oklahoma to design a flash flood model, and then eventually working with our partners in Ecuador and who have the knowledge of what's going on in the community to develop this early action protocol for forecast-based financing or forecast-based early action for flash floods, which will be the first one that's produced in relation with the Red Cross. So here's the team, just leaving off with the picture on the left. This is from a recent workshop in Ecuador. And we also have 2 recent papers here that are specifically on our work, understanding the gradients, the differences in risk, you know, at the community level. The top paper is looking at the the importance of expert knowledge, local knowledge in understanding social vulnerability for floods in Ecuador. And at the bottom, this is a new methodology of actually using Google Street View to understand street level flood vulnerability in Ecuador. So thank you very much for your time. And yes, please feel free to reach out with any questions if you have it. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you, Andrew.
Perfect. Thank you. All right, let me see if I can figure out how this is going to work. Awesome. Okay, so my name is Vincenzo Bollettino. I work with the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. This is an interfaculty initiative within Harvard University that's focused on humanitarian issues. So we do both research and education on humanitarian action. The work that I'm personally involved in is focused on disaster preparedness and resilience. Most of that work is done in Southeast Asia. I've done some work in Bangladesh, quite a lot of work in the Philippines, and increasingly doing some work in Nepal as well, and looking to expand in other areas in Southeast Asia. But what I'll talk about today is work that we've done in the Philippines over the past 5 or so years. When we do work at a variety of different levels. If I go too loud, now I'll try to go a little softer since I'm using this. We do household level surveys looking at people's perceptions and behaviors toward disaster preparedness. So really looking at the actions they take to prepare for future disasters, how they experience current disasters, where they get their information from, what information they trust, what activities they actually engage in to prepare, whether it's training, whether it's planning, or material investments in their houses or in products like putting things aside or getting generators or putting together go bags. We've also done some participatory action research at the community level. We've done network analyses, which looks at the strength of relationships across organizations to understand how organizations either work or don't work together, to see whether systems are siloed or there's actually engagement or interaction across organizations working on a common area. And then finally, we try to take information from these various levels and create media reports, basically get it into the national media and other media forms to raise awareness of the work that we're doing. The survey research, so the household level survey we did in 2017 covered 5,184 households. And we really wanted to be able to get a snapshot, a cross-sectional survey across the country, looking at people's level of disaster preparedness and what they actually did in response to previous natural disasters or natural hazards that turned into disasters. But there are two things that I want to really point out here. One is that, not surprisingly, investments that are made in disaster preparedness really vary tremendously across regions. And they're connected in part due to a particular area's vulnerability or experience with previous hazards. So if it's a place that gets a lot of typhoons, they're likely to do a lot more around preparedness activities. But it also has to do with economic justice and wealth within the country. So wealthier areas have more excess capital to be able to invest in preparedness, and other areas, whether they're exposed to disasters or not, that may be economically challenged, would have less to put in towards disaster preparedness. The other thing that I'd like for people to take away from this study is that what people's expectations are about who should be responsible for responding to and preparing for disasters doesn't necessarily match their actual experience. If we're looking at the types of disasters in the Philippines, it's predominantly typhoons, cyclonic activity. At least 20 typhoons come into the Philippines area of responsibility every year, and at least on average 5 of those make landfall and are significant typhoons. And one thing that's really interesting is that now things are changing such that rapid intensification is much more common, making the whole thing that Andrew was talking about earlier around anticipatory action, which they also have in the Philippines, much more difficult because you have a 72-hour trigger, and then you have typhoons that are rapidly intensifying in under 24 hours from tropical storm to Category 4 typhoon. So that's an issue, but we can leave that for later. 98% of people in the Philippines experienced some kind of disaster in the last five years, basically everyone. And predominantly that affects people's homes and their sources of livelihood, farms, fisheries, et cetera. I mentioned the difference between what people's expectations are and what they actually experience. So when we asked people whose role it was to respond once a disaster happened, far and away, the vast majority of people said it was the local government unit's responsibility. Others felt that national government was also responsible, but far fewer felt like local civil society organizations or international organizations had a responsibility to respond. Similarly, for who was responsible for preparing and preparedness activities, again, it was largely the local government unit, but very few very few responded that it was actually local civil society organizations or international civil society organizations. However, when we asked them who actually responded when you experienced a disaster, far and away it was people's immediate family and their neighbors who were providing the help. The national government and local government were certainly there, but nowhere near the numbers of people who expected them to be the primary responders. And here, their actual experience with neighbors, international non-governmental organizations, and Philippine civil society organizations was much higher in terms of what they actually experienced than what they expected them to do. And then, going back to the point of the sort of distribution across regions, if you take a look here in terms of material investments, Eastern Visayas is on the eastern coast of the Philippines and it's affected by typhoons regularly. And the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region of Muslim Mindanao, somewhat less so, but really the stark difference has to do with huge disparities in economic wealth. The same is true for these other categories as well. But overall, you can see basically in areas that are economically underprivileged, there's far less investment in either training, planning, or material investments for preparedness. I'm going to quickly highlight one other thing here, which is a sort of comparative case study we did between a community in Quezon City, which is an urban area, and another one in Gabaldon in Nueva Ecija, which is northeast of Manila, in a more rural area. This place had been impacted by flooding, killing hundreds of people at one point, and they moved the entire village. In this particular place, movement is a lot more restricted. It's a dense urban area, and so moving an entire community is pretty much out of the question. Some people might be able to leave, but the majority have to stay. And so it's very much about adaptation measures that they take to cope with the fact that they're dealing with flooding. This is the more rural area where they moved the village, and and this is the section of river. This is the Gabi River in Quezon City in the dense urban area. This within 24, it only takes one day of rain for this to overflow its banks and start flooding out homes. And the problem in these dense urban areas is that many of these communities along these riverways are informal settlements. So they're not people that are registered inside or with the city. They're informally settled there, and these are places that they can actually live because they can't afford to live elsewhere, and it's typically in close proximity to, or relatively close proximity to, their livelihood sources. So leaving is really difficult. That's what was experienced. The question is, do you relocate or rebuild? If you relocate, what are some of the costs of that? Livelihoods take a real hit, and if it's not a whole systems approach, and you simply move the community, what happens is that you lose. It has all sorts of other unintended consequences when you cut people away from their livelihoods. The men tend to leave. They migrate to look for work elsewhere. Women are looking, as this woman is here, she's collecting rocks to sell to people that will bring them back to use them for a variety of different purposes. But sort of livelihoods drop off significantly and has significant costs to the children as well around education. In the denser urban community, they really tried to rely on planning, but of course, you can plan and you can prepare, but they still have to deal with, and they're trying to adapt to flood risks through a variety of different adaptation measures. In the end, the trade-offs, sometimes you don't have a choice, you have to relocate, but the trade-offs are significant, and it's important to be able to recognize those. And I believe I'm out of time, so I'll stop right here with this, just to say, how did we sort of think about or conceptualize resilience based on our studies? And we found that people reported their greatest level of sort of confidence and sense of agency and control, and were the most resilient if they had access to quality services, resources, and information, if they could rely on support from their families or others in their community, whether they actually undertook measures to prepare for future disasters, and whether they believed themselves to have the ability to influence their own lives. So the mental health component of it was actually really important. And there's a really interesting link between self-reported levels of mental health and coping capacity and actually undertaking disaster preparedness measures. And that's it. I look forward to any questions afterwards. Thank you.
Okay. Hello, everyone. It's a great honor and pleasure being here from Germany. I arrived just 3 days ago. I'm a bit jet-lagged, and that is my personal disaster. But today I would like to talk about two severe disasters, flood disasters that happened 11 years back in Brazil and just 1 year back in Germany. And why Brazil? Because I've been working in Brazil for the last 15 years in the context of ecosystem management. And in the case of our floods in Western Germany, it's actually the area where I'm living. And therefore, I focus in my speech on those two areas. So first of all, a few figures. What you see here is the January 2011 Rio de Janeiro floods and landslides, which caused roughly 900 fatalities, 36,000 displaced people, and roughly material damages of 1.2 billion, both euros and dollars, because currently it's almost the same. And in North Rhine-Westphalia and Rhineland-Palatinate in Germany, it was roughly 184 fatalities. It's not yet clear because some people are not yet found. Roughly 85,000 households were affected and 10,000 companies, and the material damage was much higher here, roughly 30 billion euros in that case. So now I have to turn the other way. And the question here is now, and that is my personal question because I work in the field of ecosystem management, can nature-based solutions help prevent or at least mitigate such disasters? What are the options of nature-based solutions here? And first of all, we have to clarify what are nature-based solutions, and we just developed, or I was one of the co-authors together with UNEP and UNDRR to conceptualize a bit what are nature-based solutions. We divided them into 4 main branches, which is disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation, mitigation, and environmental management. And here I focus on that branch of disaster risk reduction. And under it, we have different approaches. And one of the approaches is ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction, or EcoDRR. And we did an analysis with several authors and published it last year. Is there scientific evidence for ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction in different types of landscapes? As you can see here, we're talking about, for instance, urban, coastal, mountains, forest, vegetation, etc. And particularly when you look at rivers and wetlands and flooding, there is clear evidence that EcoDRR measures or ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction solutions help to mitigate the disaster risk. That's first of all one of the important outcomes. And secondly, we have just submitted another paper where we looked at other approaches rather than EcoDRR under this umbrella concept of nature-based solutions, and we found that there are alone for NBS for DRR approaches, so alone for disaster risk reduction, we have another 35 approaches which are not targeting on disaster risk reduction but have it as at least one component. What does that now mean for our case study? So looking first of all at nature-based solutions in Rio de Janeiro state. So there were already, before the disaster happened, there were several initiatives, particularly also related to the National Forest Code, which aimed at one part biodiversity conservation and on the other part stabilizing landscapes. And stabilizing landscape means, for example, stabilizing slopes, as we can see here in agricultural lands, but also in urban areas. And it also means creating space for rivers and stabilizing river banks. That was already done, at least in parts, before the disaster happened. And then there is also initiatives in urban landscapes. And here we see a reforestation area in the city of Rio de Janeiro. It's community land. Looking at the Rhine catchment, that's where I live in Germany, it's not so different actually. We also focus on ecosystem-based solutions, particularly retention areas, as we can see here, along the Rhine River. Then we have additionally, of course, several gray measures. For example, we have a hybrid. No, that is a bit, okay. We have a mobile flood wall, costed our city alone $400 million US dollars to install that, 27 kilometers long. And what we also have, and that is what we go back here, when we go to the inner cities, of course, we, like here in the US, we put lots of efforts in blue-green infrastructures. That is particularly now intensified after the flood disaster which happened this year. And when we go further down to the Netherlands, it's even more. They actually transform whole landscapes into resilient, flood-resilient landscapes, as we can see here, for instance, the Room of the River program. But nevertheless, those disasters happened. And I asked myself, why could those disasters happen despite we have many solutions, we have technical solutions, ecosystem-based solutions. And first of all, the thing we look at is, of course, the H stands for hazard. We look at the hazard, and in both cases, it was exceptional. So there was strong rainfall, their soils were saturated, affected were particularly areas in steep slopes, there were also flash floods, etc. But when we look at the ELV, so that means exposure and vulnerability, there are huge differences. Because in Brazil, particularly the informal settlements on both, first of all, of course, on the exposed slopes, but also in the floodplains, they were particularly affected here. That was completely different in Germany, because here we were talking about old historic towns and villages. So that means those people are living there for generations, and particularly affected here were old people who did not move to the big cities. So that looks completely different, even though looking at the hazard itself, it's tropical, of course, it's temperate zone, but it was both exceptional in terms of climatic extreme events. And now the question is, of course, what is the potential of nature-based solutions to mitigate such disasters? And first of all, we did some research on that already, but it's still in progress. So we looked, first of all, at the rural areas, and in case of looking back in Rio de Janeiro, there is a lot of potential to restore degraded pasture lands. Because they're, from the economic perspective, they're not, let's say, the best lands. We're in mountainous areas, dairy products are actually produced somewhere else. So there is a high potential in the rural areas, but there is also potential in urban areas. But what we saw here, there are many limitations to do so. So looking at rural areas, it's very labor intensive. There is a small scale ownership structure. It's difficult to scale such measures. And there is also, because of this aging rural population, a low innovation potential. Looking at cities, and that is, I think, everywhere in the world pretty much the same, they're packed, prices are high, so actually who wants to build a park when you could get so much more money with building a business center or hotel or something like that? That's everywhere the same. And there are also, and that is particularly the case here for Rio, there are also risks because of droughts, there's plant mortality, there are fires, pests. People are scared of animals when they have forests nearby. And in addition, and that's the case for the urban areas in particular, there is crime. People don't want to have a forest nearby, and they're also used as landfills and then exacerbate even landslide risk. That is what we observed there. Looking at Germany, it's, again, there are similarities. Also in, let's say, the countryside, we have lots of options. There is also agricultural land which could be reforested or at least partially reforested. The urban area, there are some, oops, always that same thing here. There are some initiatives to unseal surfaces. There is green infrastructures, blue infrastructures, but also in Germany, we have some limitations. And here the limitations are different, Because looking at our area in the Rhine Valley, it's particularly one limitation that we have old historical landscapes. We have traditionalism, we have monument protection. But again, we have also our small-scale ownership structure, as it is in the case of Brazil. And the measures are difficult, again, here to scale. And additionally, we have also some power generation issues here. We have mining areas, etc. So it's not so easy. And in the cities, the land is limited as usual. And then there was one thing which I would like to highlight here in terms of risk. Because in our flooding last year, buildings and bridges were destroyed by trees, uprooted trees. And now people are scared, and some people even say because of the ecosystem restoration, we had more damage than without it. Of course, there were also cars washed away, trucks, etc., which destroyed infrastructure, but now they're getting scared of uprooted trees. That is one thing which I would really like to highlight here. And to finalize a bit, so what did we learn from the two disasters? First of all, what we can see, and what I did not mention here, early warning systems, including flood alerts, have improved a lot after the two disasters. Secondly, there is better coordination. We were talking before about the silos. That has improved now. So it's better coordination between civil defense, urban planning, ecosystem management, and also there were some relocations, but not too many because people don't want to move. In Germany, also, there is an expansion of blue-green infrastructure, river restoration, etc. In Brazil, it's less blue-green, it's more just green, because they're also scared about blue, because blue could mean actually sources for waterborne diseases. So they focus more on green infrastructures rather than us in Germany on blue-green infrastructure. But, and that is the last thing I would like to highlight here, is very often people don't want to move back. In Brazil, because they don't have the money to move elsewhere. We're talking about informal settlements, as you were talking in Ecuador, same thing, same situation here. And when we talk about Germany, it's another case. It's actually, there are strong community ties. So we are talking about families living there for generations, and they don't want to move to another, not even to another village. First obstacle, actually. Then also the MBS, it's quite interesting. So what we got so far is in urban areas, there's a young generation and they want nature-based solutions, while in the countryside they say, we are already living in nature, what are you talking about? So there is also a difference between urban and rural population. And finally, the last point is also there are obstacles to convert agricultural land in both case studies. In Brazil, even though it's from the economic side, it doesn't bring much money, but they don't want to convert it into forests, and the same applies to Germany. And these are the things I would like to highlight here as well. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. As Lidia mentioned, my name is Emily Gvino. I work at Clarion Associates based in North Carolina. And today I'm representing the Re-Energize DR3 project. It's funded by the Belmont Forum. And I'll be speaking about community resilience indicators and equitable stakeholder engagement. And hopefully by the end, you're not sick of me saying the word indicators over and over again. So DR3, or Disaster Risk Reduction and Resilience, is our project. It's a multi-university global stakeholder engagement project. You can see our website on the slide here if you'd like to learn more about it. We are fostering conversations about governance, vulnerable groups, and sustainable development. And we're working with stakeholders in communities impacted by disasters. In particular, the work I'm speaking on today is within the lens of flooding disasters in eastern North Carolina. So our project developed the Snow Angel method. It's a framework for identifying and engaging key stakeholders. So this framework places groups with greater vulnerability, knowledge, power, and commitment at the center of its framework. If you have ever made a snow angel and you're laying in the snow, picture how your core or your torso makes a deeper imprint and your arms and your legs make a lighter imprint at the edges. So this is a play to make us rethink the snowball method, which may lead you to a greater number of stakeholders, but in that chain, you lead further and further away from that core center that I mentioned. In the snowball method, it can support existing inequalities and systemic injustice in power and agency. So with the Snow Angel method, engagement increases and improves as you get closer and closer to the center. And those who have lived experience, local knowledge, or are impacted by disasters the most are balanced with expert insights. So our workshop, we've conducted a few. The first one was focused on the definition of vulnerable groups, and overall we hope to conduct more workshops focused on resilience and sustainable development. Our second workshop last fall, which is what I'll be talking about today, was looking at national and international vulnerability and resilience indicators. Our goal is to have a review of UN targets, goals, and indicators to help community and national programs and policies. And our goal is to empower stakeholders as parts of those conversations at the global level and to help us and to contribute to how we think about that. This is a picture here of stranded cows from Hurricane Florence in 2018 in North Carolina. So I know there's a lot on this slide, but I'll direct your attention to the left side in the column. So the United Nations Development Program, or UNDP, the framework for small island and developing states, is the only global approach for a vulnerability index. And with the adoption of the 2030 Agenda, member states pledged to leave no one behind and to also endeavor to reach the furthest behind first. And so as part of that, UNDP developed the 5 factors for vulnerability that you see on the screen here. So that includes discrimination, geography, governance, socioeconomic status, and shocks and fragility. And this involves a systems thinking approach to disadvantages, exclusion, mistreatment, and inequity. And this framework here is meant to advance the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, and the 2030 Agenda. So when we're thinking about how we apply those to SDGs, we can think about it in a 3-pronged approach. So the first is that we can examine the disadvantages that people face. We can empower those who are left behind or who are at risk of being left behind. And we can enact inclusive, far-sighted, and progressive SDG policies. So the research for the Re-Energized Year 3 project is solidly in those first 2, and then my work as a planner is hopefully solidly in the third one. So as part of this project, we conducted a review of US-based vulnerability indicators. We reviewed the 6 sources that are listed here on the far left side, and you can also see the number of indicators that were involved in each source. You can also see how they're categorized in the arrows following on the right. Each has a slightly different approach to how you roll up these different indicators in that framework for how you understand them. For our project, we built upon the research when you can see the community recovery checklist and the balanced scorecard, looking at financial, process, and then this category of learning and innovation and social. And then the last one is the public sector or beneficiaries. So as I mentioned, for resilience indicators, we're also building upon previous academic research that you can see on this slide here. And our framework is 4 categories across 4 dimensions of time. Let me know if you can't hear me. With the 4 categories that I mentioned before. And we're adding in that time dimension because, as many of you know, the 4 categories of preparedness, response, recovery, and mitigation all have very different approaches. So for our workshop, we endeavored to include as many stakeholder groups as possible. So you can see an example of some of the types of interest groups that we included here. We facilitated in-depth conversations and breakout rooms with participants, and we used Google Jamboards so that we could record and organize their contributions in real time, and also member check to make sure that we were recording what they wanted to say and how they wanted to say it. So we were particularly interested in the gaps in the indicators in what we presented. So we wanted to understand what was missing here and what are the gaps that need to be filled, particularly when we're looking at community level work at that local level. So as you can see, participants identified additional key indicators. The highest number of indicators were within the housing and medical and health categories for vulnerability, and then under resilience, the preparedness category had the highest number that they contributed missing indicators. This is also a breakdown. The participants categorized the identified 52 vulnerability indicators and the 39 resilience indicators, and we wanted to know, is this least, somewhat, or most relevant or important for your work today as you work in your community in Eastern North Carolina? So this visualizes that breakdown here. So you can see that the most relevant or important for their work under vulnerability were indicators that related to economic or financial, or medical and health as well. And then under resilience, mitigation, and preparedness were key for them in their work. So our first key takeaway, under the umbrella of vulnerability, participants identified the highest number of medical and health indicators as the most relevant. As I mentioned before, so some of these examples that they brought up in particular, so I come from a background of public health, but a lot of the stakeholders that we're working in are not within the public health field, so they wanted to have a greater understanding of how it worked in their communities for the percentage of the population without health insurance, the number of hospital beds per capita, and community health care facilities per capita. And then under preparedness indicators that were most relevant or important for their work, they talked about things like debris management plans and what that looks like at the community level, which a lot of times was not under their jurisdiction or their role, and things like the number of community and advocacy organizations involved at the local level. They wanted to have some sort of data or metric measuring that and what that looks like for them. Our other key takeaway is that the highest number of missing indicators related to housing vulnerability and disaster preparedness, specifically under those two roll-ups. So this meant that for them at the local level, there was a big gap for understanding what housing vulnerability looks like for them, specifically under flooding disasters. So a lot of the key examples that they talked about were things like housing cost burden for renters under that financial category, the percentage of the population that is unhoused, and those who own properties without titles or deeds, as we've talked about a little bit earlier. So it's also interesting to note that while participants identified preparedness indicators to be the most important or relevant for their work, they also identified the highest number that were missing from that category that would give them a better understanding into what preparedness looks like for their community. So an example that they listed was what existing and recurring evacuation or action drills look like, and which is also a particular interest for me and probably other people here, is an understanding of land use regulations, in particular limiting development in the floodplain. So those who are not trained planners at that local level but still working in resilience, knowing what that looks like specifically for their community, because as we know that's very different based on ordinances and land use plans. So our conversations really highlighted the need for flexibility based on their ability to incorporate these into their resilience work. So we hope to honor these communities and the voices that share their time and experience with us as we continue this work. We're establishing connections with stakeholders in North Carolina and coastal communities still. We're investing in partnerships with other organizations and across different sectors than we worked with previously. We're conducting more workshops and research, and we're also doing some advocacy work at the international level. This includes participating in platforms like the high-level political forum, the potential for introducing UN resolutions in the future, and we're hosting events at COP27 in Egypt, so if anybody's going there, you can look for my team at the Resilience Hub. And we hope to continue to support the development of a global vulnerability index. This includes research by team members into indicators for specific stakeholder groups. So one team member is doing research into women and gender and what that would look like for a vulnerability index specifically for that group, as well as other research into finance and insurance gaps. So thank you for your time. I wanted to give a brief shout out to my teammates who contribute to the findings and the research here. So my PI is Felix Dodds at the University of North Carolina, as well as Elizabeth Butler and Kristen Downs. My contact information is here if you have any questions. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So today I want to complement kind of some of the presentations of my colleagues to present an ongoing project that we're undertaking together with Dr. Han, who couldn't be here today. A project where the main, I guess, aim has been to answer the question of whether some of our climate adaptation policies or interventions help communities actually decrease losses, but also who benefits from that decrease if there is such a decrease. And in order to do so, we look into the community rating system. Probably a lot of people here today are aware of the program, and I'm just gonna make a very, very basic introduction of the program. This program has been going on since the 1990s, and the main goal is an incentive-based program where communities implement a series of flood management actions and that are considered best practices in the field. And the idea is that in exchange, they benefit from a reduction in their flood insurance premiums. On the other hand, there is other communities that even if they don't implement this program, they also have access to federally backed flood insurance if they do like very basic regulation of their floodplain areas. So a big data set containing information from on flood losses, from flood insurance claims, from both these types of communities gives kind of like a quasi-experimental setup that we kind of try to use to answer our question. So here you can see in this side is communities that have access in general to federally backed flood insurance versus the light dots where communities are part of the community rating system that I will refer from now on as the CRS. And so this like gibberish, you can ignore it. But basically, what we try to do here is benefit or I guess tap into some of the opportunities that machine learning brings where in order to understand in particular the type of question that we want to answer, which is not only whether communities see a loss reduction, but also who benefits from such loss. You have different covariates that you have to consider, and our traditional, I guess, models to understand these things incorporate, like for instance, if you use regression or whatnot, incorporate certain assumptions as to how that relationship works, and that is not necessarily or very hardly ever reflects the complex reality that a flood implies and the losses that come from a flood event implies. So, using neural density estimators, in this case, we can use a model that is actually free of any assumption, and we can understand how both the community that you saw earlier, that was the dark dots, and the lighter dots operate or experience losses as a function, I guess, of the different things that we look into. In this case, average precipitation that a community experiences, the median household income in a particular zip code, the number or the population at a particular zip code, etc. And so we can compare then and have an idea of whether losses have decreased in communities within the CRS, but also for which aspects of these covariates that we're looking at. So here is kind of like a snapshot of the findings. What you see here is on the red side, it means that losses are lower compared to non-CRS communities, and the blue dots means that they are higher. And this is in dollars per policy. So just want to highlight a few things here. As you can see in this area, we find that actually lower income households see the number of dollars or the losses that they experience decrease the most. And in particular, this is particularly relevant for areas where they experience higher number of precipitation and where the risk of flooding in the area is from low to medium. And we also see that actually areas with zip codes with higher number of people in the zip code benefit also the most, or they see that their losses being decreased. And this is also a very relevant finding because here you can see that actually we have only included zip codes that are 20,000 people or more. As you can imagine, there are many zip codes in America that don't comply with this measure, and actually 50% of our sample or of our data was below the 20,000 mark, but actually we find no significant effect of the program in areas below this number of citizens, which is a finding in itself. And then I also want to, I guess, highlight the blue areas or not ignore the blue areas. We find that for the same level of precipitation and the same level of population, actually losses or the number of dollars paid for insurance increase for higher income households. And complementing this with field work and a series of stakeholder engagement and interviews, we find that actually in certain towns, the CRS has an information component that communities can benefit from, but usually only, I guess, households in better positions can either attend these sessions, get more information, and learn how to file these claims in certain situations. And anecdotally, some of the interviewees actually would say, my neighbor used this insurance to pay for like a renovation of their backyard. I'm not saying that this is, the general trend, but we imagine that there is some information asymmetries that may be causing this. And this is kind of like a series of snapshots of what I just said, so that you can see kind of the gap between lower and high income households, and also how from like a certain risk score on, you don't see much of a difference, which kind of points towards the fact that the type of activities that are implemented work for a certain level of risk, but not after that. But we can talk about them later, more in the Q&A. I just want to leave you with a few conclusions from this work. One is the fact that we find, or by testing the methodology, we find that actually we can get interesting insights into how a policy works. It doesn't necessarily have to be on flooding. It can be on any other aspects, but on how it works, not only overall in whether it achieves its goals, but also which dimensions and which sectors of the population benefit the most from a policy. And we find that this approach in general, which is already taken in other policies, should be taken. We also find that flood adaptation actions benefit lower income households, and so it is important to continue investing in these type of programs. But we find that potential reevaluation of some of the one-size-fits-all requirements that in this case communities get to join the CRS may be potentially reevaluated, because in this case, for communities where we see that there's no significant effect of the implementation of the program, this is the only way they have to actually access affordable insurance. So you might be asking for communities to implement these very costly measures just so that they can afford the insurance, when you could be potentially retailoring and adapting some of these approaches to their situation. For instance, we see that high-risk zones and lower population communities could benefit potentially from a different approach. And finally, we also find the need to potentially monitor where resources from insurance are going after an event, to ensure that there is proper redistribution and the resources go wherever needed. So that's it. Thank you. And now we are going to start our Q&A section. And for that, I encourage everyone to join. Okay, so since we already have questions, I also have my own, so you guys be ready. But it seems like we already have a popular question. What explains the disconnect in vulnerability and resiliency indicators? And I don't know if Kelly wants to elaborate a little bit more. Hi, Kelly.
Sure, thanks for your question. So I think the key part of that participants were speaking about in the workshops is that there are a lot of silos in their work, and so the access to data that they have, but also the responsibility of their role really determines what they can do. So I think that's why there was such an impact or influence of health indicators as well, because they knew how much health and financial factors influenced people, at a vulnerable level in their community, but they didn't have a way to really like pull that into their work, or like, oh, that's something that sits in the local health department and we're in more in the emergency preparedness side. So I think they were thinking more about how they could break down those silos and have indicators that go across different departments at the local level, even when they're struggling with capacity and resources and in communication and different things like that. Thanks.
Seems like there is a question clearly for Udo. How do you address the impediments to implement nature-based solutions, particularly regulatory challenges?
So I have to say that is a question for me, even though it's difficult to answer that because I'm a physical geographer. I come from the landscape ecology side. So what we were doing in Brazil particularly were pilot projects. So we're working, for example, with farmers to stabilize slopes, etc. So these were pilots, but I know from my colleagues, of course, they have like payment for ecosystem services schemes over the whole state of Rio and also in the whole Atlantic forest region, where they work together with governmental authorities to implement particular reforestation and restoration efforts. And the difficulty is actually that the farmers need to get paid for those measures. When we, for example, reforest an area of 1,000 hectares, then they have opportunity costs, and that has to be calculated. That is, again, what researchers are doing. And in turn, then that will be implemented on the governmental side. Currently in Germany, it's like we have where first of all, this difference between what I've mentioned, rural and urban, right? And in urban, we are talking particularly about green infrastructure or blue-green infrastructure, and that is also more under the authorities which manage urban areas, which we have, for example, for our city in Cologne. While in the countryside, it's a completely different thing, because usually land is bought from farmers, for example. I showed this example of an old meander, and that old meander is used for agriculture and will be flooded only in the case of a high flood. And then in that case, the farmers will get paid. And it's also like contracts between governmental authorities and the farmers, because then the agricultural land is first of all not usable for a few years because it's getting polluted. And for that, there have to be made agreements with them. That is from my perspective. I think you would like to go beyond, but I'm honestly speaking more of the researchers rather than the planner, and don't have more about background. For example, you mentioned here regulatory challenges. It's a bit difficult to answer that in general, I would say. It goes in various branches.
As the lawyer in the room, and even though this was not the topic of my presentation today, I've been working on some MBS research in the US, and some of the challenges that we find regulation-wise is actually how complicated it is sometimes for branches of the government to collaborate and agree on certain ways forward. And also another issue is sometimes there is this requirement of conducting this sort of cost-benefit analysis to justify if a legal reform is worth it. And there is only limited knowledge still, even though Udo was showing us a lot of research already on it, on the benefits, particularly on the long term. We can only account for what we know so far. And so this has also been kind of a challenge that some of the government employees that we interview were talking about. So let's go for the next one for Enzo. For Dr. Bollettino, based on your work, are there ways we can use self-reported mental health status to gauge household preparedness?
Thank you very much for that question. I think in the short answer is yes, to a degree. It's one of many factors that are important in gauging household levels of preparedness for disaster. But certainly what came out in our research was that a sense of control or agency was strongly associated with a proclivity to engage in preparedness activities, but a lot more needs to be done there, and that's something that I'd really like to carry forward, because we're planning to do another nationwide survey in the Philippines and one in Nepal as well. Incidentally, earlier this morning, I did a different presentation looking for a different organization altogether, looking at the impact of COVID-19 on mental health in the Philippines. And there, not surprisingly, there was a huge increase in reported levels of depression and anxiety, amongst other mental health issues. But what came out of it was that both the increase in teletherapy and the perceived decrease in stigma were sort of positive outcomes, and there were some interesting coping measures there that I also want to be able to fold into the to looking at links between mental health and preparedness.
I'm actually gonna scroll down. I think we have another MBS question, right?
Competing land interest is it's a big issue also in Germany, particularly in suburbanized areas where you have, for example, around Cologne that was impacted during that flood event. We have mining areas, we have areas where we have wind parks, wind farms, we have agricultural land, vegetable production, intensive production, etc. So currently the big discussion is on multi-coding land. That means that we use the same piece of land for 2, 3, 4, several different things. In the Netherlands, they made that for recreation, biodiversity conservation at the same time, disaster risk reduction, adaptation, etc. So we think from not any longer in the different sectors or silos. So we think actually over, as an umbrella, actually over the different sectors, and try to multi-code areas. And that is easier, of course, in the countryside. In the city, that's much more difficult. But these are the first steps to do so, I would say.
Also slightly related to that, in my work as a planner, it's not necessarily competing land interests, but a lot of work at the community level is talking about how some communities that live in affordable areas are then afraid of improvements or maybe MBS that add to the value and then lead to green gentrification or displacement, not from disasters. So if anybody has solutions to that, let me know.
I'm just looking at this last question here on US-based examples of research similar to the Philippine study. I think there may be another panel looking at perception-based surveys that is part of this National Adaptation Forum. I believe I saw something in there, but there are studies, for example, on the impacts of Sandy. There were some perception-based studies looking at Sandy. I don't remember exactly what the titles were, but Patrick Vink was one of the authors of that study.
We have a tricky question, and I would love to hear what you all think about this. What are the reasons that communities resist support, and how do you overcome them? So yeah, if you have this figured out, please let us know.
I think that's very context specific. It has to do with it has to do, generally speaking, with the economic, political, and social situation in each of the areas that we're talking about. So for example, in the Philippines, if we're talking about Mindanao and the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region of Muslim Mindanao, a lot of it has to do with lack of trust based on being pushed from lands, especially among indigenous people. It has to do with sort of historical internal colonization of a more Christian north into a more Muslim-based society in Mindanao. So there are many factors that I think impact a community's either acceptance of or reticence to accept services, engagement on these other issues, and sometimes there's just ongoing conflict.
And I'll add to that with what I said before about gentrification and displacement, that we were in a session yesterday, a pre-forum meeting that talked about operations about climate and equity and comprehensive plans, and engagement at that level to get trust from the very beginning of the process was something that came up a lot, because a lot of these processes are coming in at and getting stakeholder engagement later in the process, and the community is losing trust because they're saying, why did you come to us so much later and not at the very beginning, where we can have a real impact and influence at this stage of the project, or at this stage of talking about a plan at the local level.
I would also add to that question, there is actually a session in the forum, I think it's tomorrow, but basically the topic is stop telling us to be resilient. And I think this is also kind of one of the reasons, or like a community attitude, that sometimes is this reframing from taking responsibility in fear that they are gonna be left alone facing a situation like an extreme weather event. So this is also something that in field work we have found from different sectors of communities, where they kind of don't want for the existence of certain programs where they have to also take part and collaborate and prepare and receive support, to mean that they are then in charge and they are not going to be helped.
I think we can scroll down, but I wasn't able to do it.
I love this question for a bunch of academics. Yeah. We deserve it. How do we move the academic research to action?
I think we should be asking you.
The same communities get flooded all the time. I think that increasingly some of the research in academia is actually being used to inform actions on the ground. I don't think there is one particular way. I think that dialogue between, or an increasing dialogue between academia, decision makers, and also communities, the way we even generate the knowledge, the way we build our models, has to be informed by the community's experience, has to be reflective of actually what is needed on the ground, rather than just some kind of theoretical, exercise or thinking exercise that doesn't lead to action. And I also would say that participatory action research, some of the things that Dr. Bollettino was talking about earlier, has also kind of become a tool where certain neighborhoods and communities here in the US and in other places are actually becoming part of the process of even science making to solve the questions and the problems that are important for them. And I think that's also a way in which some of these issues where, I guess, scientists or academics can contribute their grain of salt together with other sectors of society.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent question. I think in a very kind of formal, older academic track, if you're going out for a tenure track position in many fields, there's so much pressure just on the publications that I think they have limited time to really be engaged at community levels. But then there are all kinds of other academic positions like my own, where I'm not on a tenure track, that I have all of my work is research focused, so I don't have a teaching obligation. And so in those cases, you can really engage, I think, at the community level. But so in my experience, what we try to do is engage communities at every stage of the research. So when we design the survey instrument, for example, we have a wide representation of the community, both professionals working at various levels of society, but also people from the community are engaged in the process of actually talking about what's important to them, what information they need. That goes directly into the design of the survey instrument. And once we've finished and done the data collection and the analysis, we return to those communities to help interpret those results and what they mean for that particular community. And then we try to translate that into actual training for people that can actually take action. So for non-governmental organizations or international NGOs or others that are engaged in the particular thing that we're looking at, we try to take those findings and bring them back into specific training.
Briefly, I'll mention an example in North Carolina. I was not part of this, but in Raleigh, the Museum of Life Science and NOAA and a couple other partners did an extreme heat mapping exercise, so it's citizen science, and they were walking and bicycling to do heat mapping, and I think it was a good example of this because they were taking best practices from academia, but then they were putting it on the ground and then getting data that was open source to the community and built by the community, and so, you know, it's not flooding, but it was really useful for community members and decision makers at that local level.
After the flood event in Cologne, there was a big discussion on that topic, how to get out of the ivory tower. And there was also money spent now. We won a project, for example, 10 million euros for the next 5 years to develop what they call co-creation, co-development, co-design. I'm pretty sure that's the same as in the US. And we even engaged co-designers to communicate with policymakers, planners, the civil society and researchers, and just to create those linkages and bring the research, on the one hand, bring research to those communities, on the other hand, to engage communities to contribute to research. And I'm pretty sure these kind of initiatives, you have it here as well, right? Yeah.
I see there is this question on where can I find data on community needs related to resiliency within US and beyond. I think that I'm personally happy to share, so I'll leave my email later and we can stay in touch depending on what exactly within resiliency you're looking and what type of, I guess, indicators and data, but I don't know if you want to share anything right now or also be contacted about it later. Yeah. Okay. Then I love this question from Kelly. What explains the disconnect in vulnerability and resiliency indicators? I think that this is always such a tricky question, having like vulnerability and resiliency, at least from my perspective, being two sides of the same coin. I don't know, what would you have to say about that?
I talked about this one a little bit earlier.
Do you think that is covered?
Yeah.
Yeah, I talked about this one a little bit earlier.
Oh, okay.
I'm just looking at the second one. Do you find that DRR expectations and actual experience differ depending on specific factors? For example, rural versus urban, low income versus high income? Yes, they did. I don't have the factors off on I can't recall the data off the top of my head, but we did include those, and they were important indicators. Especially economic, sort of household level economic capacity was particularly important, but the rural and urban differentiation was also an important factor. Lydia, it looks like there's one for you.
Yeah, I see a question for me on the CRS, and thanks for the question. This is actually something that we're looking into right now by using not only the level or like the CRS status of the community, but also a breakdown of the points that they get per activity. So stay tuned, send me an email, I'll leave my email later, So if you want the results or whenever the paper is out on that, I will let you know as well. But for this particular study, we use a binary whether the community was participating in the CRS or not. Yeah. And I think we're out of time. Thank you so much for all your amazing questions and your patience. And it was really great sharing a little piece of our work with you today. And we hope that we continue engaging. And please, I'll leave my email, but just as a way, if you want to contact anybody here, for you to be able to. So please reach out with any further questions or any ideas, recommendations, criticism. Everything is welcome. Thank you.